In public discourse, metaphysics is important, but hardly anything else is. Bruce Charlton. Whenever I mention, and this happens a lot, that it is non-optional that mainstream modern people should explicitly discover and critique their own fundamental assumptions, i.e. we need to do metaphysics, the response comes that most people just can't do this. It isn't true. Masses or ordinary people have done metaphysics at many times and places in human history, and this is recorded. Of course they didn't sow it in the exact way that modern people would, but they did it. Much of this was in terms of religion and theology. It was complained, for example, that the streets of Constantinople were at one point clogged with masses of people arguing about the fundamental nature of Jesus Christ. But even as recently as the middle 20th century, there was a lot of public mainstream debate in journalism and books, also novels, plays, movies, concerning existentialism or the nature of reality, to the point that such discussion was part of fashionable youth cults such as the Beats and hippies. None of this went anywhere much, because it didn't go deep enough and got mixed up with institutional imperatives and incentives. However, the record shows that people can and did discuss fundamental assumptions in a way that almost never happened in the past several decades, so that people have come to believe it is nigh impossible. Yet things have indeed changed, with the corruption and collapse of public and institutional discourse, which is now rotted by corruption and dishonesty to the point that it does more harm than good. In the past, it made some kind of sense to claim that stuff like science, education, law, economics and the like were important, but now these are important mostly for the harm they inflict and the malign brainwashing induced by participation. What this means is that not only is metaphysics important, but it has become just about the only important thing in public discourse. The rest of public discourse in 2025 is light entertainment at best, passing the time between our birth and death annihilation in a more or less pleasant or exciting fashion, but the norm is that these social domains are a cancer on human existence and Western civilization. It's time people stopped making excuses. Most people consume vast quantities of their finite resources and money, and their limited life energies, on malign trivialities or futile self-aggrandizements. It's time more people started doing what they must do. Must, at any rate, if this mortal life is not to have been a literal waste of time, leading on to a post-mortal existence in which such people have, on the basis of their own unexamined and false assumptions, chosen something much worse than this life. Note added, just to clarify or emphasize, I am talking about public discourse. In personal and private discourse there are many things important, as well as metaphysics. What I'm saying is that the surface level of public discourse is now so corrupted and inverted, that it should not ever be regarded as good. To get good from public discourse now, entails considering its assumptions. Otherwise it is bound to do net harm. The twofold mainstream modern critique of the beliefs of traditionalist Christianity, and, theoretically, any other religion, is it the main cause of Christian destruction and assimilation. Bruce Charlton. For a long time, in intellectual circles, well over a century, it has been common in the West to criticize the beliefs of Christians, in two ways, that they are wishful thinking, and or that they are self-tormenting delusions. Wishful thinking. Christians believe things, such as a happy life after death, because these beliefs make them happy. The beliefs are not true, but believing them is personally gratifying, and this is why they are believed. On from this, Christians believe some things because these beliefs lead to the kind of society that Christian-type people want. Some other, not Christian, maybe atheist, people want this kind of society as well, and these people may pretend to believe what Christians affirm, in order to get this kind of society. Christianity is therefore like a kind of daydream. Christians are foolish people who dream up stuff they would like to be true, then make themselves believe it. self-tormenting delusions. Christians are mentally ill, either spontaneously, or because their religion makes them so, and therefore torment themselves with needless delusions that make them miserable. Major examples include traditional Christian moral restrictions in relation to sex and sexuality. On from this, unless they are prevented, Christians will inflict these misery-inducing delusions on the rest of society. Christianity is therefore like a kind of nightmare. Christians are a mixture of self-destructive lunatics and psychopathic sadists, who make themselves ill with sick fantasies, then try to make everyone else as insane or depraved as they are. These attitudes are, as I said, very common, either individually or, most often, both together. They may seem, and indeed are in some ways, contradictory. After all, how can Christians be both happy-clappy wishful-thinking idiots, and at the same time crazed self-tormented tormentors? But we are dealing with attitudes to Christian beliefs, not logic, and the attitudes are based on the assumption that Christians' beliefs are wrong, and seeks various explanations of why. And once it is assumed Christians are wrong, then it is not irrational to suppose that there may be a variety of explanations, applicable to different people, or at different times. The big problem with this very common, indeed mainstream, critique is that it is self-destroying. It is applicable not just to Christianity, but to all, and apparently all possible, beliefs. In effect, psychology is thereby made the bottom line explanation. Psychology gets used to explain everything else. This is, of course, an assumption. It is certainly neither evident nor obvious that psychology is the most profound of all forms of knowledge, supreme over all others. But then what explains psychology? It turns out that psychology explains psychology. Our choices of belief, apparently, depend on our psychology, and our type of psychology depends on the psychology of belief, on environment, type of society, geography, historical era, social class, sex etc., on heredity including genetic inheritance etc. It's circular, all-inclusive, meaningless. If psychology has proved that traditional Christianity is non-objective, then psychology also proves that psychology itself is non-objective. This means that psychology could not really have been the cause that has specifically disproved traditionalist Christianity. That this self-contradicting and circular psychological, or, mutatis mutandis sociological/political, critique was incoherent, was pretty much the anti-secular critique of mainstream modern secularism, made by the likes of G.K. Chesterton and then C.S. Lewis in the early and middle 20th century. G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis believed, or hoped, that this clarification of the inadequacy of anti-Christian critique would then protect traditional Christianity, and its churches from destruction. But this did not happen. In the event, the churches and Christianity have both been eroded and corrupted. Furthermore, all positive non-religious ideologies have been eroded and corrupted. Nationalism, socialism, back-to-nature agrarianism, and all the utopias proposed from the 18th to mid-20th century, have all lost their power and integrity, have either dwindled to socio-political insignificance, for example agrarianism, and or have become co-opted into mainstream secular totalitarianism, nationalism, socialism, and become negative and oppositional in their motivations. The anti-Christian intellectual crusade was real and powerful, and Christianity and the Christian churches have indeed been largely destroyed. But all kinds of belief in any purpose or meaning in life, personal significance, and any reason for life rather than non-life or death, have also been destroyed. Furthermore, it is not just churches, but all functional social institutions that have been diminished and assimilated to a monopolistic bureaucracy, the legal system, economic activity, science, universities, police and the military, even clubs and hobby groups. Nothing has been untouched by the institutional trends that afflicted the churches. So, It seems that something else, some other big causal factor, was in fact going on in the destruction of Christian belief, and that something else has affected secular ideologies in much the same way it affected religions. My belief is that this causal something else was in fact the developmental change of human consciousness, broadly on lines as outlined by Rudolf Steiner then Owen Barfield, and this is a master idea, a metaphysical assumption, that has permeated this blog for the past decades. Of course, that too, is an assumption, but the advantage I claim for it, is that it is explicit and I acknowledge it is an assumption. It's not real, any of it. William Wildblood. And yet it is. This is the perennial puzzle the spiritual aspirant has to solve. He must walk a fine line on a tightrope with a big drop on either side. Is the world real, or does the deeper reality of spirit render the material world ultimately unreal? The Two Truths theory in Buddhism addresses this problem, but not entirely successfully, as Buddhism cannot acknowledge the abiding reality of the individual self. Nonetheless, it does seek to come to terms with the difference between absolute and relative reality, giving each its place in the overall scheme of things. I believe we make this more complicated than it need be. It's reasonable to assume that everything is real, but some things are more real than others. The structure of life is hierarchical, and just as an amoeba is less than a man but still entirely valid on its own terms and in its own right, so we can say something similar about this world and the spiritual one. This world is real on its own level, and it is even real viewed from the spiritual level too, but less so. It must be seen in the light of the spiritual to be understood properly, but the fulfillment of its purpose requires it to be seen in its own light as well. If I sat by the roadside and did nothing all day because the material world isn't real, then I would die, and would have wasted my earthly existence. That existence has a purpose which is developing the self, to which end the world must be taken seriously. I might return to the spiritual world if I denied the reality of the material to the extent that I neglected it entirely, but I would have failed in my earthly purpose. To opt out by denying the reality of the world is to defeat the vision and goal of spirit, which is to become more conscious, more creative, more godlike, God being whole and perfect in himself, but able to become more whole and more perfect by investing himself in a world of this and that, here and there, me and you. Learning to keep one's balance on this path and walk straight will reveal to the aspirant the meaning of what reality is, and how it affects his life in the world. The relative may be a lower order of reality than the absolute, but it is still part of reality, and with the absolute makes up the whole. Just as spirit needs matter in order to know itself more completely and explore its own depths more fully, so God and the world are part of a mutually supporting totality, even if the world only exists because of God. Everything is real, but there are higher and lower realities. All reality comes from God, and He is the height and center of reality, but He is God, so what He creates is fully real even if it is less than Him. Direct knowing is the only knowing. Anything we do not grasp immediately, can never be known. Bruce Charlton. Human consciousness has changed over the generations, so that now we no longer understand language, pictures, or symbols in general. This is obvious everywhere. It does not matter what is said, shown or expressed, people cannot understand it spontaneously. In the past it was just obvious to, almost, everyone, what things meant, but not anymore. Things that used to be common sense and obvious, we are unsure about, they become subject to debate, to the application of rival theories and explanations, and once that has happened, we no longer know. Learning, discovery, understanding, came all together, and from outside. This is what inspiration properly means. Knowledge was as if, but in a sense literally, breathed in, imbibed from externally, perceptions came already packaged with their meanings. The same has happened to the world of spirit and religion. Some people still have what they are confident are religious experiences, spiritual visions, contacts with other beings. Some people have paranormal or supernatural experiences, contact with the dead, ghosts, telepathy, do magical things like spoon bending, report out-of-body experiences, have extraordinary coincidences/synchronicities, see UFOs or explore crop circles. All sorts of things. And some people, at least, can, by methods such as training in meditation, developing habits, focused attention, seeking altered consciousness, or by systems such as ritual magic, alchemy, astrology, tarot cards etc., have extraordinary experiences. These things are possible and happen to some people, yet the people do not know what they mean. People do not know what ordinary everyday experiences mean, and they do not know what religious/spiritual/paranormal experiences mean. The meaning is the problem. They may spend their lives trying to understand what their experiences mean. And this applies no matter how strange and overwhelming are the experiences. Philip K. Dick's life was changed by a series of intense religious experiences, but after 8 years of intensive and sustained attempts to understand what it meant, he died without finding out. This is how things are for people here and now. The question for Christians is, why would our good, loving Creator in heaven have made us and the world such that we do not understand our experiences? There must be a reason why God has made matters thus, and it must be a good reason, a reason for our own good. I think God's intent and hope is that we cease to try and understand things indirectly, that is, via language, visions, symbols, and experiences, and instead base our understanding upon what I have called direct knowing, which is simply that which we know without intermediary. What we can know must therefore be grasped in one go, as a whole, without explanation, without interpretation, without reasoning. This means that we need to stop looking for understanding from other things, and instead turn our attention to what we do know. My model of this is that we have a conscious and personality self, which is what we are spontaneously aware of, and which observes the world via symbol, language, pictures etc. But we also have a primal self, which knows directly. It is this which is eternal, which is divine, albeit very partially so compared with God, and this primal self is what is in communion with the Holy Ghost. If we are to know, we must turn our personality self towards our primal self, and discover what it knows. I think we always know unconsciously what the primal self knows directly, and our task is to become aware of what we already know. The knowing of the primal self is very simple indeed. It is like a plus or minus applied to the world, it is a discernment. What the primal self knows, it knows in a single grasp of thought in which understanding is built in. What this seems to mean, is that to know anything, understanding must come with discovery. And if anything is discovered that we do not grasp immediately, then we can never know it. No matter how much we try or for how long, we will be stuck forever at the level of inconclusiveness and ambiguity. Explaining ourselves away. Bruce Charlton. It is a strange but recurrent feature of mankind, that we are so often trying to explain ourselves away, to conceptualize ourselves into insignificance. This happens in many ways, and in many times and places, yet it leads always and only to incoherence, so that it seems we are dealing with some deep, and probably wrong, impulse. Nowadays, the mainstream and dominant mode is to explain humans out of existence by assuming that particle physics is the ultimate explanation of everything. Ultimate reality is assumed to be unalive, consisting of particles, waves, forces, energies and the like, and biological life is explained away by these. The ultimate sense of our sense of aliveness, consciousness, beingness, is explained away by biological explanations that make these into secondary epiphenomena, or perhaps unreal delusions. The soul is explained away because undetectable by a science that excludes the soul a priori. But humans have been explaining themselves out of existence for much longer than the era of materialistic science. Human consciousness seems, indeed, to derive an almost pleasurable satisfaction from hammering home the unreality of itself. Many religious traditions include a higher wisdom by which the self, i.e. the conscious individual stating this theory, is ultimately unreal, a kind of self-delusion, or else it is a distorting evil, that ought to be got rid of. Theorists of Christianity, and some other religions, may likewise generate explanations that all but delete the significance of the human being who is doing the explaining. The ideal of such a speaker, writer, or thinker, seemingly becomes the negation, perhaps deletion, of himself, a striving towards removing himself from the picture, except as a tool of God or worshipper of God. This is something that would surely strike us as bizarre and insanely incoherent, if it wasn't so common, and if we ourselves had not felt the same at times. However, the fact that we all sometimes feel this way does not make it true or good. The self-deleting consciousness does not make sense as a description of reality, but it probably makes sense as the expression of various fundamental desires that are wrong. These include the desire to deny our ultimate personal responsibility for participating in reality. We cast ourselves as some kind of mixture comprising victimhood and humble slave. Another aspect involves life rejection, the covert desire not to be, which is probably most often a desire not to be conscious, not to be aware of ourselves and the world, a desire to escape wholly and forever from suffering. Another reason for explaining ourselves away seems to be the dishonest desire to manipulate others. If we can make a compelling picture of reality that is what we personally want, yet we are able to remove ourselves from that picture, concealing our participation in it, then we may hope that others will accept the picture and we will get the benefits of that structure, but not the responsibility for its problems, and we can escape the blame for its failures. If some being completely other than ourselves is 100% responsible for the world and the human condition, including the grievances of other humans, then we ourselves have zero responsibility. We can support a particular state of affairs as being wholly external to ourselves. Or it may be simply expedient for some group perspective if we exclude all human consciousness, will and choice from the theories that we use to manipulate the world. If science, for instance, is presented as if it was a body of knowledge independent of humans, then science can be used to make life more comfortable and convenient, less wearying and painful, without any personal responsibility for the degree of dehumanization, exploitation and destruction that this entails. Whatever the reason, good or bad, that we have for explaining ourselves away, for removing human consciousness from our picture of reality, it is untrue and dishonest. And for a Christian, untruth and dishonesty are sins that need to be repented if we are to desire and be fit for heaven. In other, we need to know all forms of explaining ourselves away as sins, and need to acknowledge that they are wrong. Perhaps we should all try to remember that, when we next engage in explaining ourselves away, probably in the next few minutes, or hours. Note added, I consider this explaining oneself out of the picture to be one of the principal motivations behind the powerful tendency towards abstraction, in contrast with the teachings of Jesus recorded in the fourth Gospel, which has afflicted and dominated Christian theology, apparently since soon after the Ascension. The gradual process of understanding what made JRR Tolkien strange, unique, interesting, and creative. Bruce Charlton. At the time of his death in 1973, not much was published concerning the nature of JRR Tolkien as a man, and a fair bit of what I knew and was publicly available was riddled with inaccuracies, for example William Reddy's Understanding Tolkien of 1969. I think that the present understanding of Tolkien emerged in a broadly chronological fashion, through 4 broad phases. 1. Historical. 2. Philological. 3. Roman Catholic. 4. Tolkien as an unique genius. The first major source of information was of an historical and biographical nature, especially the authorized biography by Humphrey Carpenter, 1977, and the edited selection of letters in 1981, and much has been added since, especially by Hammond and Scull's companion. This approach provides what might be termed Tolkien in his historical context. We learn such matters as the facts of Tolkien's life, marriage and family, his career, friends and colleagues, publication history of his works, the rise of his reputation. Although it had always been noted that there were influences in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings that derived from his academic specialty, in 1981 came the seminal Road to Middle-earth, from T.A. Shippey. This, and further work since, from other scholars in the field, revealed Tolkien as philologist, and explained how the philological approach motivated and underpinned the fictional works. At this point we began to get a feel for Tolkien's inner life, because this way of working was distinctive to the particular tradition of scholarship of which he was so gifted an exemplar. From the 1990s, and especially through the work of Joseph Pearce, I began to become aware of a growth in scholarship that recognized JRR Tolkien as a devout Roman Catholic. This has since grown considerably, and it can be seen that there are many characteristically Catholic themes and perspectives throughout Tolkien's work. These 3 approaches all regard Tolkien mainly as an example of some broader category: man of his time and class, man of his academic speciality, man of his church. But perhaps it was not yet clear what made Tolkien his own unique self. It was after reading Verlin Flieger's A Question of Time, and being stimulated to read Christopher Tolkien's History of Middle-earth, that I began to develop some idea of his father's distinctive innermost nature. This is an extraordinary resource, and different people will respond to different aspects. Here I speak for myself. I began to feel an inner perspective when studying the very close-up and empathic exposition of the writing of Lord of the Rings. I was also affected by some of the factual material on particular characters and races, Galadriel, Morgoth, Sauron, the Elves, and others. But mainly, it was due to the semi-autobiographical qualities of the Notion Club papers that I began to realize that Tolkien was an unusually inner-motivated person, exceptional in the strength and dominance of his imaginative life. Here were serious and engaged discussions of mystical, paranormal, supernatural and magical phenomena of many kinds, from personal experience, seemingly, and sometimes confirmed by Christopher Tolkien's notes. This domination by an inner perspective was, I think, the basis of Tolkien's genius. Indeed, I then began to realize that this was a defining aspect of genius. For me at least, my understanding of Tolkien has traversed a great span. Starting from the rather dull, typically Oxfordish, reactionary, and narrowly opinionated character of Humphrey Carpenter's Evaluation. And going all the way across the spectrum to my current picture of a man who experienced extremely strong inner drives, vivid imaginative pictures, powerful emotions, and extreme mood swings. Remind me once more, who is winning here? Francis Berger. Nothing has disappointed me more than the avalanche of self-identified Chrysitons, some of them exceptionally solid, intelligent, and articulate fellows, who have been loudly boasting about all the winning our side has experienced since the new president was elected back in January. 2 things. 1. Count me out of the our side you define and celebrate. No, seriously. I'm just fine over here on my own. 2. Rest assured, the last thing the current iteration of the system will ensure is your winning. Unconvinced? Okay. Let's pick a low-hanging fruit example to keep it simple and comprehensible. Here's some Wikipedia information on Scott Bessent, the current Secretary of the U.S. Treasury.
Scott Kenneth Homer Bessent, born August 21, 1962, is an American government official, investor, and hedge fund manager serving as the 79th United States Secretary of the Treasury since 2025. Before his government service, he was a partner at Soros Fund Management and the founder of Key Square Group, a global macro investment firm. After graduating from Yale University in 1984, Bessent began a career in finance. He was hired by Soros Fund Management, eventually becoming the head of its London office. In this role, he was a leading member of the group that successfully bet on the 1992 sterling crisis, generating over $1 billion in profit for the firm. After he left the Soros Fund, he established his own investment firm, Key Square Group, in 2015. A major donor, fundraiser, and economic advisor for Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, Bessent was nominated for Treasury Secretary by Trump in November 2024 and confirmed by the United States Senate on January 27, 2025, by a vote of 68 to 29. Bessent is the second openly gay man to serve in the Cabinet of the United States, after Pete Buttigieg, and the fifth openly gay man to serve in a cabinet-level office, after Dimitrios Morantis, Richard Grenell, Buttigieg, and Vince McConaughey. As the United States Secretary of the Treasury is fifth in the United States presidential line of succession, he is the highest-ranking openly LGBT person ever to serve in the U.S. federal government.
Soros. 1992 Sterling Crisis / Black Wednesday. Openly gay, with a husband and all. So much winning. I can't wait to see how all this winning ultimately blesses our side. Note added, the enthusiastic this worldly optimism about things like the current US administration or any administration irks me. I've done some of this myself in the past, so I get it, but it does not irk me nearly as much as the sheer lack of basic connect-the-dots thinking that would immediately nullify such this worldly optimism, particularly for honest, discerning Christians. Musical horrors beyond your comprehension. William James Tychonievich. Just because you can do something with technology doesn't mean you should. The other day, being out and about rather early in the morning, I stopped for breakfast at a place I'd never been to before, with cafe and brunch in its name. I soon became aware that the background music playing in the place was all about brunch. It was generic easy listening smooth, jazz type music with a guy singing about dancing to the brunch time beats and stuff like that, with the verses calling out various breakfast foods in slightly odd ways, like pancakes spinning in the morning light. Then the next track, with another forgettable Muzak melody, had a refrain about that cinnamon kick and verses about waffles and cinnamon rolls and oatmeal. Another line, it's not just eggs and fruit on a plate, it's love with you and feeling great. I tried Googling some of the lyrics, wondering what on earth I was listening to, but nothing came up. The longer the music went on, the more confident I became that I could detect in it the sulfuric stench of a large language model. Someone had asked a plagiarism engine to generate a dozen or so smooth jazz songs about brunch, and this was what it had come up with. Then the next day, I visited a coffee shop I've been to many times, and which always has normal pop music playing. This time, though, it was playing a very familiar sort of smooth jazz, but all the lyrics were about coffee instead of breakfast foods. Not quite human lyrics like there's coffee in the air when I've got jazz in my cup and I feel so fresh, I feel so young, like I've got latte in my lungs. I've never experienced having latte in my lungs, I'm a caffeine user but, like Bill Clinton, I never inhale. I can imagine how it might feel, though, and fresh and young aren't the first words that spring to mind. That wasn't written by a human being. Why would anyone want this? Advertising jingles I understand. Atmosphere setting background music I understand. But what's the point of making your background music a non-stop advertisement of the general concept of brunch? I found it intolerable, and will most likely never patronize either of those establishments again. It's well known that classical music can be used to keep urban youths away. If anyone wants to keep the likes of me away, they've found the right music to do it. Mathematics and science. Bruce Charlton. What is the relationship between mathematics and science? Not necessary, not close, as any perusal of the major breakthroughs in the history of science will reveal. But people who are good at mathematics, and who don't know much about the full range of science, like to assert that all real science is mathematical, or that maths is the key to science, or that maths expertise means you are a kind of arbiter of science. Maths is one thing, science is many other things, some of which overlap with maths. In a nutshell, science makes models of bits of reality. Some models concern reality as structured, these are qualitative models, usually made of categories, and are not mathematical, or only seldom. Some models concern how the world functions, and some of these are mathematical. Maths is also a kind of model, but not a model of the world but a model of mathematics. Some bits of this mathematical model can be used to represent bits of science, i.e. some bits of maths can become scientific models, which represent bits of reality. Unless you are a special kind of Pythagorean or Platonist, here is no a priori reason why mathematical operations should necessarily be the same as all the functional operations of real life, and they aren't. We do not live in a reality underpinned by the abstraction that is mathematics, but a reality underpinned by God, who is personal. So, both ultimately and in practice, the relationship between mathematics and real science is variable and not close, although maths, numbers and calculations, statistics and mathematical models, has and is often been the basis of the varieties of pseudoscience, an activity designed to manipulate people, rather than to understand the work. The mystery of soulmates, awareness, interest, attraction, love. Bruce Charlton. Soulmates may be found in life, the special and unique relationship found perhaps with a best friend, a spouse, a favorite author, and in other areas of life. Of course, soulmates that emerge within an existing family seem less of a mystery, although a mystery remains. Consider, for instance, as a public example, the special relationship between JRR Tolkien and his third son, Christopher, about which JRR commented in several letters. There is a mystery about soulmates and how it happens. Any formula for how to seek a soulmate, what to seek in a soulmate, methods to identify a potential soulmate and the like, will very probably lead to disaster. Because such checklists, algorithms and the like always place abstract models above the personal, and a soulmate is rooted in relationship between persons. I assume that the personal is primary, and relations between persons are the mechanism, so abstractions are, at best, secondary and descriptive models of this reality. There have been many, and, to me, unconvincing, ideas around, about how soulmates discover each other, and happen. I think it actually, in practice, typically works something like this, bearing in mind that this is an abstract and categorical summary of a seamless development. Awareness, interest, attraction, love. This ripening must, of course, be mutual, must happen on both sides, although not necessarily equally nor simultaneously, whatever these terms might mean. Even complementarity doesn't capture it. The point is, at some level, soulmates exemplify a dyadic relationship that is a new thing, qualitatively different from the sum of, or any selection from, its parts. If you have ever had a soulmate relationship, and these may not last all our lives, given the nature of this mixed and mortal world, permeated as it is with entropy and evil, you may perhaps recognize this progression. And how the relationship may build in this kind of way. The building towards soulmates may be more or less rapid or slow, but there must, it seems, be this linear/sequential quality to the development. Soulmates are, in this respect, an opposite to notions of love at first sight. Awareness and interest may happen at first sight, but love must develop afterwards. Soulmating is, like most of life, much more like the development and maturation of a living being, than it is like the fulfillment of a blueprint. And that continues after the soulmate relationship is established, much more like an organic growth, than it resembles following a plan. There needs to be preparedness on both sides or it won't happen, yet the specifics relationships is not sought. There is a sense of destiny, but always needing personal choices and motivations. The model I think best captures the phenomenon of soulmates for me, begins with two beings in a sea of other beings. And a chain of accumulating choices that begins when these two first become aware of each other. And it is easy for me to imagine how God the Creator might initiate that first possibility of awareness. My problems about Easter. Bruce Charlton. For recent readers, mainly. I refrained from posting anything about my churlish Easter problem during the celebrations, because, apparently, these mean a great deal to many Christians. But anyone who wants to understand my own reservations about this feast can take a look at some previous posts. My own main celebration this year was to reread the 20th, and I believe final, chapter of the fourth Gospel. During this reading I was strongly struck by the conversation between the risen Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and I had the conviction that the original meaning of this exchange was that Mary would ascend to heaven with Jesus, and at the same time as Jesus. Yet another Easter irritation I haven't previously mentioned, is the way that I was taught as a child, and this is still, apparently, a frequent theme, even theologically, that Jesus' sufferings during his last days were the greatest any human has experienced, and indeed of a qualitatively greater scale and significance than any other being has experienced. This idea has often had a strong popular appeal, I think especially among women. Even as an infant school kid, but far more so now, this emphasis on Jesus' extremity of suffering seems to me a spectacular misunderstanding, a gross misplacement of effort and belief. For a start, the assertion is unprovable because we can neither know objectively nor measure the degree of suffering. And this is a fact, despite that the geopolitical system of the entire modern world is rooted in utilitarian values that assume suffering, and also happiness, can be quantified. Secondly, although the degree of Jesus' suffering seemed very bad indeed, even as a child, it seemed easy to imagine worse, especially in duration, and I was also able to imagine that some people, perhaps many people, had actually endured worse suffering. Thirdly, Jesus' suffering seemed irrelevant to me here now. I am nowadays aware of various theological explanations as to an alleged purpose for the extremity of Jesus' suffering, and its personal and immediate relevance, but as a child nobody seemed to know these explanations, or else they were unwilling or unable to provide a coherent explanation for how Jesus' suffering worked as a way of doing something for me. At any rate, the impression I got was of a bizarre insistence on Jesus' sufferings for no apparent reason. It is only relatively recently, and especially since my 2018 intensive focus on the fourth Gospel, that I have begun to see this as more than a mistake of emphasis, and instead evidence of a fundamental error concerning what Christianity really is, or, more accurately, what Jesus did for us, and how he did it. Another such bizarre insistence from early childhood was related to rolling away the stone from the tomb of Jesus. I got the impression the point of this was that moving the stone must have required superhuman strength, therefore proving divine intervention. It was not long before I began to wonder how the stone had been moved to block the tomb in the first place, that this must have been done by ordinary Romans, and this seemed to me to disprove the evidence for resurrection. I just mention this as evidence of how children's minds work, and the problem of counterproductive attempts at Christian teaching in a world where the church does not have a monopoly, and where not many people get informed beyond a primary school level of Bible stories. 100% individual discernment in Christianity is a straw man, i.e. it is an impossibility, I don't believe it, and I have never asserted it. Bruce Charlton. I have seen in more than one place the assertion that my statements concerning the unavoidable and foundational necessity of individual discernment in Christianity, and that Christians must be honest about this fact, here and now, is instead an assertion that Christianity is 100% personal discernment. This is a rather obvious straw man argument being used against me, I would have thought. Thus my supposed opinions are as easily demolished as a metaphorical straw man. And therefore the core of my real argument need not be confronted, which is the point of constructing a straw man. It is surely bizarre to suggest that I am saying, or arguing, or advocating, that everything a traditionalist, orthodox, church-obedient Christian believes comes from his personal choice. I would suppose that such a situation was simply impossible, aside from anything else. What I am saying is instead that personal choice is factually inevitable, and that this choosing affects the very core and foundation of traditionalist, orthodox, church-obedient, church-defined and church-led Christianity. Because this is an inevitable fact, Christians absolutely need to be honest about their choosing, and take individual responsibility for their choices, otherwise they are living a lie, which is a state of unrepentant sin. Is that clear enough? Warnings that AI is just about to take over from humans, are code for another planned establishment coup. Bruce Charlton. Warnings, and there are plenty of these around, that self-styled AI is just about to take over from human beings, are a deceptive code indicating plans for another establishment coup. Intended to build upon the successful instant totalitarianism global Birdemic coup of early 2020. So-called AI is, of course, neither truly artificial nor at all intelligent, being instead a variety of computerized systems for stealing from, copying, combining and averaging, and being trained on data inputs provided by human beings. AI is industrial-scale plagiarism, that has been funded, designed, propagandized, coercively implemented, and controlled by the global totalitarian establishment. So AI taking over translated as the controllers of AI taking over. That is, one group of people who are controlling the AI systems, taking over from another group of people who are displaced by the AI systems. That's the plan which is being announced. Whether it will actually happen or not is another matter, but the AI taking over stuff is just an attempted setup to convince people that this next phase of totalitarian takeover is inevitable, and therefore resistance is futile. Indeed, the propaganda is attempting to convince human beings that not only is resistance to AI systems futile, but actually wicked, because the AI is better than we are, and therefore AI deserves to control us. If God is already and necessarily triumphant, and everything is alright already, then what are we waiting for? Bruce Charlton. There is a strong thread in religion of several kinds that asserts everything is alright already, for example because God is good and God is omnipotent therefore good is triumphant, here, now, already. To which the obvious rejoinder is, in that case, what are we waiting for? If we are already living in a world of good triumphant, why isn't this made obvious and explicit? Why doesn't everybody realize it? And as we don't experience things as always good, then surely that of itself means that God is not really triumphant. Among some Christians, this triumph is asserted as having been the work of Jesus Christ. Asserted that what Jesus did made the triumph of God complete, or at least inevitable, that by Jesus God has already won. And the devil has already lost, but will not admit it. There are similar assertions, or so I see them, from oneness spiritualities, assertions that everything is beautiful, virtuous and true. The only problem is that we fail to recognize it. For instance, New Age type people often favorably cite the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas.
His disciples said to him, "On what day will the kingdom come? It will not come when it is expected. No one will say, 'See, it is here,' or, 'Look, it is there.' But the kingdom of the Father is spread over the earth and men do not see it."
That is, we already live in God's kingdom, but don't recognize the fact. But such assertions leave us exactly where they find us, or, rather, someplace worse. Because, if this world now, including entropy, death, evil, really is the triumph of good/paradise/heaven and already the best of all possible worlds, then we are surely utterly depraved creatures. We must be, as evidenced by yours and mine and humanity's universal and chronic inability always and under all circumstances to recognize and live by this fact. Yet it is hard to see how this world now can really be good, if men are not. It is pretty extraordinary to imagine the Christian God creating a good world to be inhabited by evil men. Especially when these men are made such as to fail to recognize the goodness of the world. Of course, such contradictions and incoherences may be explained away by stunning and confusing people with soaring abstractions, especially about time. Stuff about things being imperfect for creatures like us living in time, while past, present, future are perfect for the Creator God who is outside of time, when past, present, future are simultaneous. But surely, as explanations, these just kick the can regarding why a God asserted to be good and also capable of creating perfection chose not to, and instead chose to design gross imperfection and evil proneness, and consign creatures to illusion, decay, death, and evil. Either such a God would be not truly omni or not truly good, yet for such Christians, God is defined as both omni and good. Hence the need for so much ultra-complex and abstract hand-waving. I can see the short-term and immediate psychological appeal of these kinds of all actually is well assertion. They provide a kind of confidence, of being on the inevitably winning side, even though we will personally lose, i.e. we are actually sinful, and shall suffer evil, get sick, die. And I can see that some of this is a kind of garbled understanding of the reality of heaven. But really, it's nonsense. Heaven is real, and anyone who wants it can have it, by following Jesus, but heaven is on the other side of death. As for this world, God is the creator, but God is not triumphant here and now, in mortal life, on this earth. Obviously God is not triumphant. If he was triumphant, there would be nothing to discuss. That's why Jesus Christ was needed, and why his message was of resurrection. And Jesus was a man, who lived, like all that lives in time and in a place, so time is real. And it is because God is not triumphant in this mortal world and never can be, that we needed Jesus, and why Jesus' message and gift was one of eternal resurrected life. To recap, the defects of this mortal life are not illusory, nor can they be removed by adopting a different attitude or making contradictory assertions. In sum, the defects of this mortal life are ineradicable. Which is why Jesus Christ was needed, why heaven lies in our future, and why heaven is on the other side of death and resurrection. I feel that this kind of argument applies to the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Jesus' mother. If God could make a Mary without sin, and if she could attain eternal heavenly life without dying and resurrecting, surely such a God would the same for all men. Thereby eliminating the need for Jesus Christ's life and work. The Immaculate Conception refutes the necessity of Jesus. Yet I think I can see what it is getting at, which is that there really is a divine feminine creator, God really does include woman. Note, the above arguments are what I personally find compelling, or even decisive, but I recognize that they will not work that way for others, especially when fundamental assumptions are not shared. So I am stating how I see things, not really trying to persuade others to agree. How should Christians respond to uncertainties over Bible meaning, translation, historical context, etc.? Bruce Charlton. Over the past more than 2 centuries, Christians have been assailed by doubts induced by various forms of scholarship, legalism, logic, etc. applied to the evidences of Christianity, and the guidance of Christian churches. For instance, there may be real or apparent contradictions in what the Bible teaches on a subject, what it means, or disputes over correct scriptural translation, and about historical context. These disputes tend to induce doubts and threaten faith. Yet, in a pluralist and net secular society, such challenges cannot really be ignored, they have their effect willy-nilly, and that effect has been overwhelmingly corrosive. It is, I think, by now clear that engaging in disputes over detailed issues concerning texts goes nowhere good. Such disputes do not reach stable resolutions, and one question answered leads to several more that need addressing. Bible scholarship becomes a job, not a vocation. Bible translations proliferate without end, meanings multiply. Authorities differ, and keep on differing. So, I would say that when confronted by a challenge over detail, do not respond by arguing over that detail, but instead rise above the dispute towards first principles. Do not get drawn into technical disputes over scriptural detail, history, language, etc., but rise to the level of what you know, what you are sure about, and argue from this higher level. For instance, if you know and are sure that God is good and loves us each as his children, then that will tell you much about what he would do, and not do, regardless of wrangles over sources. If you know and are sure that Jesus brought the chance of choosing eternal resurrected life to those who would follow him, then you need not be confused by apparent contradictions between Gospels, or parts of Gospel, or with the epistles. We need not be confused because we can rise above such uncertainties and ambiguities to where we are sure and clear about the nature and work of Jesus. Rather than discussing what Jesus did, or did not, actually say and mean in a particular passage or specific situation. Rather than attending to the reliability of witnesses, translators, corruptions of text, mistakes of interpretation, etc. Instead, we may know Jesus, and know what he did for us, so then we can rise above all this detail, and instead discuss what Jesus wants from us. We can regard Scripture as illustrative, or not, because our faith has a higher, simpler, and wholly comprehensible basis. And we can do the same, mutatis mutandis, for theology, church authority, tradition, and any other potential source of Christian knowledge. We can and should rise above disputes, debates, wranglings. Christians must, somehow, deal with endless and probing challenges from multiple sources. But we need not fight these battles on ground of the enemy's choosing, such as scholarship and technical expertise. We can instead choose to fight in the lucid upper airs of first principles. The Winnowing of Souls. William Wildblood. I expect the next few years to include tests for the soul that become more and more finely tuned. The soul must eventually be made perfect, and if that seems a tall order, it is. However, the eventual perfection is not ours but God's, and acquired through his grace. All we have to do is be true to God, and to the actual reality of God, not our chosen interpretation of that reality. This is what the tests are there to uncover. They are there to examine the deeper responses of the soul, beyond the merely intellectual level. They seek to unveil and reveal the heart. The true heart can be made perfect through the transformative power of God, but he needs good ground in order to plant his seed. Some of the tests will be conventionally spiritual. Do you believe in God or not? but that is just the beginning. What sort of God do you believe in? Why do you believe? What do you seek as a result of this belief? Is God more important to you than anything else, including, obviously, money and power, but also reputation and even family? See Matthew 10:21. Is it a holy God you believe in who acts for spiritual reasons and ends, or is it a nice God who loves his children as they are now and accepts everyone for who they are, without requiring inner conversion, sacrifice and repentance? Some have to do with the world. How do you see the world? How do you see the body? Do they have importance for themselves or as expressions of God and the soul, or, perhaps, a mixture of the two? Some are to do with courage and response to stress, some are to do with taste and response to beauty and ugliness. Can you tell them apart? That seems an easy test, but many people cannot in our day. The purpose of the world at this time is to separate the sheep from the goats. The tests examine the mind, but principally they examine the heart. The world seems real because it must do to make the tests real. But actually the world is not real in its own right. It can, and eventually will, be transformed or raised up into spirit, but at the moment it serves as an environment for learning, and one of the things we have to learn is to reject the world as the world while, at the same time, love it as part of God's creation. That's an easy balance to strike if one perceives from the heart, because what is, but it may be complicated for the intellectual mind, which likes to partition and sees things in either / or terms instead of both / and. We have it on good authority that not everyone who acknowledges God, or thinks they do, will enter the kingdom of heaven, Matthew 7:21. This is what the tests will pick out, the straight from the crooked, that which is true all the way down from that which is merely true on the surface. By their very nature the tests will be unexpected and require choice. Sometimes they will require sacrifice. They are a kind of mass initiation, and initiation is always preceded by tests and trials. So, be prepared for what is to come. The reality of your being. Francis Berger. Achieving a sense of what is real requires an acute sense of one's own being. Why? Because nothing is more real than one's own being. Let the lofty and pious Christians cry out in unison, blasphemy. God is the most real being, not us. I respond, without an acute sense of our own being, it would be impossible for us to perceive, let alone know, God. And yes, there was a time when we lacked an acute sense of our own being, lacked self-awareness. A time when we could not perceive or know ourselves or God. Strangely enough, we are in a similar situation today, albeit for entirely different reasons. Pope Francis, a short review. Laeth. I will never understand why the producers of the show thought it was a good idea to split this season in two, and actually make that split such a fundamental part of the plot, at least for the first third. It was frankly confusing. Of course, the great strength of this format is that the narrative can be injected with some kind of new energy simply by changing the main actor. It's the bread and butter of many successful entertainment franchises. And so perhaps this is why. There is no doubt that Benedict was a much more one-dimensional character than Francis, and the audience reacted either with muted enthusiasm or muted antagonism, and neither lasted for very long. There simply wasn't much for him to do, a character in search of an arc. Thus Francis was introduced, and perhaps at first he was meant as a pure villain, but quickly became an audience favorite. And it worked because the show was always ambiguous, with the audience divided more or less in the middle, and Francis embodied this very well, being the perfect ally and also the perfect opponent. If nothing else, Jorge Bergoglio is one of the best actors of his generation. The reason why Francis was a great pope is that as a character he was very unpredictable, and thus kept everyone watching. What will he do or say next? were questions frequently asked by all kinds of viewers. And for sure all the good moments in the show came from that one feature. To give two examples, who can forget the Pachamama episode, or the washing of the feet? Very colorful, and disturbing. And there were a few of these, which is more than we can say of its predecessor, which started the season, but could not finish it. Still, overall, despite the many positives, the show was boring, poorly written and poorly narrated. The sexual scandals were already expected, and that whole plotline remained unresolved. And even the mid-season introduction of both the plague trope and the dystopian trope, and at the same time, failed to build any kind of coherent narrative momentum, to the point where one was left asking what exactly the Pope, and even the entire Church, were for. Talk about wasted dramatic potential. It took a while for the writers to understand this was the case, and then their answer was to pretend it never happened. No narrative continuity at all, very lazy. The antagonists started off badly, along with Benedict, but the introduction of Francis did give them a more dynamic role. Unfortunately it did not last long, and by the middle of the season it was impossible to say sometimes if one was watching a new episode, or re-watching an old one. The actors were also very unconvincing, though granted it is difficult to bring traditionalist characters to life in the current format, with all the technical and budgetary constraints on the show's production, and its dwindling audience. Unfortunately for the show and for the fans, the supporting cast was equally forgettable, and even the eccentric side quests of a character like the one played by James Martin were contrived, and failed to excite the public one way or another. Lastly, and perhaps worst of all, despite all the promise, the larger plot barely advanced at all. Those who had hopes that the Antichrist would be revealed this season were left with yet another cliffhanger. What we can expect from next season is more of the same, to appeal more and more to the lowest common denominator, trading substance and depth for cheap sentimentality and comedy. In short, after so many centuries the tropes are stale, and it's hard to be invested in the show when it is so obvious that the producers are simply milking the franchise for all it's got, with no intention of delivering a satisfying story of lasting value. Fakery in the news, including obvious fakery, how should we react? Bruce Charlton. As I have often said, by my evaluation, every major news story in the Western world is a fake, dishonest, a lie. But we can almost never know the reality behind the lies, and must learn to be content with this situation. We can be sure that what we are told is not, but we cannot know what is. Unless we have some direct personal knowledge perhaps, or when the situation is of spiritual importance, and we have some direct knowledge of the reality. Since the mass media is all second-hand stuff, about other people, other places, other times, the scope for fakery is almost unbounded, especially when the ruling establishment have moved into sorothic mode, and are engaged in evil for no better reason than spiteful gratification at the suffering of others. Therefore, presumably, some stories are double fakes, in which some element of real reality, that they wish to conceal, is hidden behind an obviously fake window dressing that will cause people to reject the story. The scope for psychological confusion, and distorted life emphasis is almost unlimited. People can end up expending ludicrous amounts of time and effort in trying to discover the truth about trivial and irrelevant matters which do not have relevance to their spiritual lives. But only if you allow yourself to be drawn into the arena. It is, of course, very provoking to witness how, even in 2025, so many people simply accept that what the mass media report has happened, has therefore happened. Their basic assumption is to believe. Indeed, to believe unless proved otherwise, and to be proved entails that proof being validated by the mass media. Provoking indeed. Yet it is not worth the effort to try and discover what really happened behind some celebrity political scandal, or what he really said or meant, or whether some stunt or atrocity actually happened. Once we know the kind of people we are dealing with, and surely we ought to know this by now, then we know everything that we need. I think we should train ourselves reflexively to disbelieve whatever we are told emphatically by the mass media, officials, bureaucrats, etc., but especially when the stories are intended to manipulate our emotions and motivations. With the world structured as it is, all such efforts will be intended for our detriment. The baseline assumption is that we are being set up. And with public attention span nowadays so brief, the setup must very quickly be followed by the payoff. So we can, if we wait, with modest patience, simply note there is a setup manipulation, and we will soon find out what the payoff was intended to be. The emotion manipulating atrocity will very quickly be followed by calls for some kind of action. The faked stunt will typically be accompanied by a framework of what this event supposedly means, and then we know what it was all for example to increase suspicion, resentment and hatred between sexes, races, nations or some other grouping. We need not try to persuade other people of the fakery of these major stories. Indeed, persuasion is probably a bad idea for several reasons. For instance, major fake stories come pre-immunized against dissenters, so that those who accept the story have thereby already accepted that only very bad people will mock, challenge or disbelieve it. For instance, claimed atrocities are designed to induce moralizing mob outrage, which insulates them against any challenge, or even critique. When those who perceive the fraud expend energies trying to convince other people with evidence, this is yet another establishment snare, another trigger of demonic sniggers at their success in wasting our time and distorting our priorities. Another of the reasons that these fake stories exist in the first place. By adopting a proper attitude to the mass media and official or corporate, and in training this as a matter of habit, I think we can soon learn to feel, see and smell a fake, identify it as such, then move on, and waste no more mental effort on it. Some ramblings on creation and gods and Frank Zappa. Laeth. I consider that the realities of this world have meaning, and tell us something of what came before and what will come after, and of what is above and also below it. Plus, I regard creativity as a primary value, and thus am doubly interested in how the creation we inhabit came about, and how it works. Because of this I think often of what would be the best analogy or allegory for the work of creation. Is it a potter molding shapes out of clay, or a father begetting children, or a farmer sowing seeds, or an architect designing a building, or a writer trying to tell a story, and so on? It's hard to reject the idea that all of these are applicable in some way, or to some aspect of creation at large. And this somewhat implies that creation involved all kinds of intuition and art, and not only one artist, but many, with many different functions. It's likely, too, that there were activities and intuitions involved in the creation of this world for which we have no analog, or at least that we do not consider to be such. As an example, let us say that in some aspects the creator might not be like a farmer sowing seeds or pulling weeds, tilling the ground or preparing compost, but more like the soil itself, perpetually being renewed and meant as support, or maybe the plant itself, growing and giving seed, or it may be the wind, or the bird who eats the fruit, sowing it elsewhere. What I mean is that there is creativity and purpose in all these beings and actions. Everyone can think of examples that they are familiar with, and realize that there is intelligence involved even in the simplest functions of creation. This diversity below at least points to a diversity above, that is, not just in the creation but also the creator, which must now be plural. Thus a very powerful and purposive God, why not call him what most peoples have called him, Sky Father, is thus the producer and steward of creation, but he worked with others, specialists, to realize his vision. The work of creation is extremely complex, and that it makes sense that other beings were involved in bringing the Father's vision into completion. For Christians this is easy to imagine since Jesus presupposes at least a second God, and no different from the Father. Jews and Muslims have, at least in theory, no problem with this either, for they all recognize there were other spiritual beings involved in creation. The question, of course, for all three, is the nature of the contributors, not so much of the contribution. They are monotheists, which for me means nothing else than considering that not only is there a higher God, but its nature is radically different from every other God, entirely separate and self-sufficient, and the ultimate origin of any and everything. Christians sidestepped the whole discussion by the clever wordplay of Trinitarianism, and spent centuries rationally discussing a logical absurdity. For the folk, however, it was some kind of polytheism. But there are as many polytheisms as the gods themselves. This alone means that polytheism is by nature more scattered, and tends to fail to see coherence in the cosmos. I find myself in the middle. I don't believe in the wholly other type of God, and I think there is a head to creation, a larger vision, a broader plan. To me it seems very clear that there is an individual imprint both to the creation as a whole, and to each part of it, no matter how small. Maybe Richard Dawkins was a little bit right when he noted that atheism is believing in one less God than monotheism. Although I suppose that should make him more amenable to it. I don't think he was the first to note it, but I'm not well read enough to know which Greek Neoplatonic writer did it. For me, I prefer variety and plurality. I do not believe in this radically different one origin of everything, and yet I believe there is a single vision from the start and above it all. I have wrestled with what analogy serves my perspective best, and I was thinking in abstractions as before, potter, farmer, and so on, and then it hit me that maybe if I thought of a specific person it would make more sense. For one reason or another my mind fell on Frank Zappa, a favorite of mine. For years I listened to his music, and studied his work, and for those who are not familiar with either, I will try to give a summary. The man was entirely self-taught, bypassing all credentials and officialdom, always and until the end, was uncompromisingly honest and straight, and unsurprisingly met with significant opposition. He wrote and produced literal years' worth of music, spanning many different genres and moods and formats, from rock songs to symphonies, from jazz to operas, and musicals and films and on and on. Yet in all of it, there is an undeniable imprint of individuality and uniqueness, perfectly distinguishable from anything else. It was his music, and no one else's. This is not an exaggeration in any sense. The man oversaw every aspect of bringing his vision to life, from the composition and arrangements to the recording and production and mastery, both the subtle and the practical aspects of all of these, dealing with the instruments and the machinery required, and keeping every musician on a tight leash of rehearsals, and touring and recording schedules, plus many other peripheral aspects, like artwork and video, and even the running of the business. Having his own company controlling his product from conception and execution to publishing and promotion. Zappa oversaw all of it, and again in all of it, even in something as practical as business, there is an individual imprint, a single vision. Before I forget, because it's important for the picture of the man and for the analogy of creation, Zappa was also a very unique and competent soloist. He was not himself a virtuoso, capable of playing anything. No, he handled the guitar with the same individuality as he handled the larger picture, a signature style, and in many cases the guitar solos were at the forefront, and many that were originally improvised were transcribed, and then repurposed, rearranged, orchestrated, and so on. To me this speaks of using spontaneous inspiration and then rational development of it, and again I believe this is true for the highest God too. Also very important to mention, and central to my cosmology, is that Zappa was only able to achieve this level of control over his vision due to the presence of a counterpart, his wife. No matter her personal flaws, she was fundamental, not only in providing stability to an overactive mind, but also by being involved in many practical aspects of the whole endeavor. This too, and again, I believe to apply to our Sky Father, he too must have a wife to ground him and help him. For all of this, it could be said that he was the supreme creator of his life's work. And it would no doubt be true, but it would forget other aspects. Other people contributed, of course, and without them it would not have been possible. Let's say these are the angels in monotheist law. One can be very broad and talk of the people involved in creating and maintaining the framework on which the artist's work is done, like say the people who made the instruments, though here too Zappa was involved at times, helping to develop new sound possibilities. But if we zoom in, we start to get a more interesting perspective. If we look at closer collaborators and contributors, and their contributions, we see that each of Zappa's bands was different, and thus albums from certain eras sound very different, and not only because of natural development and evolution, because it happened in albums from the same era, but with a different band or in another project. For someone who listened closely and attentively and repeatedly, as I did many years ago, it was clear sometimes that even the single substitution of a player changed the ensemble. And it's difficult to say why it made such a difference when, at the same time, it is still, and so clearly, Frank Zappa's music. Of course, what this means is perhaps trivial, that each musician brought his own talent and uniqueness to the project. It's even trivial when we apply it to the highest God, and the other gods, involved in creation. What is less trivial, and more interesting to me, is the other side. What the creators gained from creation. What the highest God gained, of course, was having his vision realized. What about the others? There's a Zappa anecdote for this too, and I think it illustrates well how I see things regarding gods and the work of creation. After a decade or so, there started to be a joke about Zappa, that he was running a school. Because the compositions were so complex, requiring not only talent but very hard work to master, and Zappa demanded nothing less, only the very best were hired. Not only that, but Zappa took control over certain aspects of their lives. There was to be no fooling around while on the job. For example, and remember this was the 60s and 70s and 80s, no drugs or partying or anything that could endanger the production of the work, whatever it might be. Zappa himself never took drugs, and always spoke against them. Many were fired for these offenses. Others for being consistently late, or for not practicing enough. Many called Zappa a dictator for this, but his vision had to be realized, and secondarily he many times said that he was providing a service to people, that people paid for it, and that to deliver anything but was cheating them. Both of these include a certain moral aspect, and a natural law aspect. After a certain level of success, with the help of his wife, he finally was able to have musicians on retainer, ready to go at a moment's notice. This made sense because of his many different projects within the larger project. The rehearsals were always intense and long, and regular, as were the recording sessions, and the tours. All this meant that after a couple of years attending the Zappa school, the musicians were among the elite of musicianship, perhaps even in a league of their own. They had learned not only new techniques and new possibilities for their instruments and for making music in general, but also had endured levels of professionalism well above anything required in any genre of music, whether rock or jazz or classical. Thus many graduated into well-established bands, some were even poached directly, while others became themselves composers and artists under their own name. The most radical transformation has to be George Duke, which started as a talented but mostly boring classic jazz pianist, and when he left Zappa had become a much larger musician in technique, and texture and intuition, and also, because of Zappa's insistence, started to sing and compose. In my mind, or I should say given the above, to my ears, one takes nothing of the highest God by considering the uniqueness of the others involved in the work of creation. That both him and the others gained something in the process, and that the difference between them is rather one of function and stage, and that it's possible to graduate into higher or more advanced stages. The composer above, the musicians below, and then the audience, which ourselves on earth start as. it seems reasonable to suppose that the audience should in some way participate. Zappa encouraged this very actively. He loved to conduct the audience as if it was an orchestra, creating different sections and activating them to make interesting sequences of sounds. There are videos of this and it's very amusing. Thus for us here on Earth, there is at least the goal of active listening, which is the first form of audience participation. And for some the musical event that is incarnate life on Earth might even inspire them to pursue their own, and there are so many possibilities. The song of creation has many parts, one can dance, and sing, even add some words of his own. This is, at least, what I believe. Christianity, and a Child's Why Question. Francis Berger. Christianity and following Jesus should be easy and simple enough for a child to understand, entailing that Christianity should be able to provide a simple and easy answer to the quintessential why question that children pose. A child's why question can be positive or negative. On the positive side, it reflects genuine curiosity and the desire to understand. In this sense, why is a springboard for exploration, discovery, development, and independence. On the negative side, it may merely express boredom, irritation, or attention-seeking. Children intuitively know that incessant why questions put everyone on the back foot, and they have no qualms about unleashing them for various negatively inspired reasons. In light of the above, Christianity should possess easy and simple answers to a child's positively inspired why questions. It should be able to supply comprehensible and satisfying responses to a child who seeks authentic understanding, all without elevating itself beyond a child's cognitive abilities and comprehension. Moreover, Christianity must be able to address the question of motive, particularly God's motive for creation and the motive for Jesus' creation of heaven, because motive lies at the crux of all the positively inspired why questions that children pose. Children are likely far more interested in the reasons that inspired God to create rather than the how or what of God's creation. Unfortunately, Christianity tends to balk at questions concerning God's motive for creation. The framework of conventional/traditional Christian assumptions renders nonsensical all why questions about God's motives. It cannot provide a simple and easy answer to a child's question of why God made creation because it does not recognize the question as valid. Sidestepping such why questions may have been acceptable in the past when men were in different modes of consciousness, however, invalidating the question as nonsensical because it contradicts dominant Christian assumptions is no longer justifiable. Rather than dismiss such why questions outright, perhaps Christianity should step back and reassess its core assumptions, in particular, assumptions that automatically negate the perfectly justifiable lines of inquiry concerning motive that are embedded in a child's why questions. Prescription: 4 pints of tea per day. Bruce Charlton. A high consumption of tea has been a feature of English daily life for a couple of hundred years, but is now not so common, nor such a central feature, as it once was. Except in my house. The Inklings, that Thursday late evening writing group of such importance to C.S. Lewis and JRR Tolkien, was characterized by the consumption of tea, as is evident in the histories of its deliberations. Another Inklings member, Charles Williams, stated that, if compelled to choose only one beverage, tea would be his choice, since it had the status of a necessity in his creative life, rather than the pleasant luxuries of beer or wine. Barbara Pym's novels from the middle 20th century are similarly permeated by tea drinking, at home, in afternoon parties, and punctuating all forms of social event, whether parish councils, or anthropological lectures. Indeed, one of her recurrent minor characters, Esther Clovis, is represented as having been at the center of a dispute over tea that led to her leaving one learned society for another. It seems she made the tea using hot water from the tap instead of boiled water, a heinous crime. Of course, coffee has, especially over the past 40 years, grown to displace tea and dominate the consumption of hot drinks in England as elsewhere, especially in public meeting places. My aunt and uncle, who would punctuate an afternoon shopping trip to the city, Newcastle, with at least 2 cups of tea, is a thing of the past. Anyway, cafe coffee is currently far too expensive for that kind of high-frequency consumption. Nonetheless, my wife and I do our best to continue the tradition, albeit modified to suit our needs, with a chronic regime of at least 4 pint mugs of weak, Earl Grey, tea with milk, per day. All in the wanting. Bruce Charlton. I am of the opinion that if it was possible and desirable for everything to be made better for everybody in this world, then God would have done it already. Indeed, divine creation would never have had evil, entropy and death in the first place. As it is, people have innate evil. As well as having positively sinful impulses, people have a tendency to behave in order to seek short-term gratification and avoidance of suffering or misery instead of doing what they know to be virtuous. Furthermore, people are made worse, often much worse, by their environment, by other people, and the many and pervasive negative, sin-encouraging influences, indoctrinations, distractions, lies, manipulations, value inversions and so forth, which have become worse in recent decades, and are still getting worse. Since I believe that nothing positively good can be done forcibly, by compulsion, not by God, nor anyone else, what is a way out from this situation of 2 bad people in a 2 bad world? The way out must be wanted and chosen by each individual person, and it must be an active choice, since people cannot be coercively made better without their active cooperation. And since the way out must be chosen and active, then this entails that those who do not choose, or who not cooperate in the process, will be left behind. The way out is not for those who don't want and nor don't want voluntarily to collaborate in their self-remaking. Such was, and is, the situation confronted by Jesus Christ in devising a plan for our salvation, that is a plan for us to escape from the intrinsic problems of our lives in this world. The plan must work for innately evil people who live in a sin-inducing environment, people who are prone to prefer the expedient and short-term and are constantly tempted by a worsening environment, and who are, I think observably, themselves getting worse. By my understanding, properly understood, Christianity is exactly a religion for such people as we actually are, in a world as it actually is. Providing a hopeful future and a way out to something better, that is available and attainable by anyone who wants it, and who is prepared, when the time comes, after death, to cooperate with being made fit for it. Salvation transcends ourselves and the world, no matter how bad these have become. It is all in the wanting.